Greetings once again and welcome to the Gaming Codex, the show where I will try to explain to you all the various terms used to describe video games and the video games industry. And today's term is difficulty. And according to a general definition, difficulty often does not refer to how difficult a game is in general, but rather to a setting of the game, often chosen by the player in the menu or at the beginning of the game. That is, if we are referring to the difficulty setting. If not, then it would be the degree of knowledge and skill required by the player in order to be able to properly play the game as it was intended. In the beginning, video games did not really have that much of a difficulty setting, and in the beginning they were player versus player Pong type of affairs. Now there is the old joke that you can make Pong harder by making the paddle smaller, and in this way you can make it more engaging because it will require a higher degree of skill to actually be able to hit the ball properly. But Pong didn't have that option. It was just a joke from the 70s show, but people actually modded it into Pong at the hardware level. Difficulty settings started showing up when people began fighting against the AI of a game, though not at first, on account of the primary usage of games for a time was in the arcades, and in there you didn't really want people to be able to choose to play on a lower difficulty level, because if they failed more often then they would pay more money to actually be able to finish the game. That's why live systems were first implemented in video games to suck people out of their money. But as video games became more common in the households, difficulty options were implemented in order to let more people play them. Again, not all games had them, especially not in the beginning. On account of there was an expectation that if you were trying to play a game, you would try to understand it, you would have a certain flair for it maybe. You wouldn't really have bothered buying a system if all you wanted to do was to press right and win. And for some games, the concept of a difficulty level did not really work on account of what could you change. In a game like Ultima 5, could you make the Shadow Lords less kill you anxiety? The world less works by its own rules, so it probably should maintain it at all times? Or Blackthorn less fascisty? No, so that's why those games and many others did not have a difficulty setting. But to appeal to a broader audience, maybe to people that did not have the physical capabilities of playing a game as it was intended, they added difficulty settings to reduce difficulty in case you just wanted to go through the game and not really stress out. Normal would always be there, there wouldn't be anything taken away from the people that wanted the original experience. And then they added hard modes and harder modes and harder modes for people that really don't have anything else to do. And that's how we got things like easy, normal, and hard, where some games embraced a more comical way of representing difficulties, such as Doom and Wolfenstein, Duke Nukem, Carmageddon, with things like I'm a big fat baby and don't hurt me please, to Bring the Pain, I'm Hell on Earth, and Nightmare, and so on. As for how those modes are actually implemented, well, here we go with the popular definition, and that would be that the enemies become smarter on hard. No, this is rarely the case, and I mean extremely rarely the case. Most video games, when you play them on easy, they're the same game. The enemies behave in the same way, they think in the same way, they are sometimes even in the same numbers. What changes is usually that they become insane bullet sponges that'll take hours to kill for no reason other than that increases the difficulty, and they generally deal more damage, though not always. And this is mostly referring to action games, shooter games, where the spike in difficulty tends to become immediately apparent after the first enemy encounter. They will also often increase in numbers in shooter games especially, which may actually make the game harder to play from a hardware point of view, on account of, for example, the latest Doom not working well on the highest difficulty on the Switch, on account of there being too many enemies on the screen. Not even in the case of most strategy games will you see enemies actually becoming smarter. On the other hand, you will have them gain resources out of nowhere just so they will have the ability to produce more units, or they may get a multiplier to the amount of units they collect, or there is also the fact that the AI in strategy games cheats through the virtue of it being able to control every unit at the same time while you are limited to what your human abilities can do. Sometimes you'll get the AI being limited in this way on normal difficulty and have it just be full out Skynet on higher difficulties by being able to individually control every unit to the point where you have to be a micro king to be able to compete. You also have difficulty in adventure games, believe it or not, but some of them did have difficulty levels. Monkey Island 3, for example, had the Super Monkey mode that enabled more difficult versions of the puzzles you would encounter in the game. Now, since a lot of those puzzles did kind of require a Moon Manny kind of logic, you often didn't bother with that if you just wanted to play the game. But if you are there because you are a sadist, absolutely. But some games do not have a difficulty setting at all, even today. The games that were made to be played on one difficulty setting, the games that were made to be played in one way, the games that are cohesive from beginning to end, or at least that's what the developers believe, and don't need anything else. They don't need enemies that are tougher, enemies that are weaker, more of them, less of them, unless they make a second version that costs as much as the first one, that just reshuffles enemies and also upgrades the graphics and it's compatible with 64-bit but the other one wasn't. So you get that one and believe that it's the original one, but it's different. But that's a whole other matter. And yet some games, even though they don't have a setting for difficulty, they still address it in some way. For example, if you save your game too often, you will be insulted that you're playing it on easy by saving every time. You have to make a jump, or before and after you encounter an enemy. And this is actually something you see in games that do still have difficult settings. Depending on what difficulty you play on, they may give you different outcomes, different endings, or they may just outright insult you, and not just by calling you a big fat baby. Now, what is the marketing definition for difficulty? Well, that would be, we want everyone to be able to finish a game, otherwise they won't buy the sequel. In the general market of video games, the AAA market, this is the predominant idea. If the players get too frustrated with the game, if they're not able to understand how to play it, they'll stop. They'll disregard this. They will not play the sequel, which they will never make because, you know, they don't make anything other than sequels now. So the game not only does they have a low difficulty setting just for them, a story mode even, but they also have less difficulty in the other sense. A lower requirement for skill, for knowledge, for understanding, for playing the game. Now, that is not necessarily a bad thing. You do want everybody to be able to play a game. You're not making that Russian puzzle game where everything is as obtuse as it can be and you have no idea if you're doing well or not. But that's an extreme. That's at the end of a spectrum. And story mode is at the beginning of that spectrum. There is a whole plethora of things between them, and yet we sort of move more closely to the beginning of it, to the lower difficulty standard, where you don't really do much. Honestly, you're not expected to perform well. You're not trusted by the game developer, by the game that you have the attention span of a housefly, at least somewhat better reflexes than I had when I was paralyzed, and at least the interest of trying to get better at this game. Big companies cannot really expect players, all of them I mean, to care, like to actually care about the game. They want to buy it, then throw it away, and then buy the next one. That's it. Otherwise, the whole house of cards crumbles. Of course, you do have multiplayer, which in itself has its own difficulty level caused by other people. But since we're sort of veering to the microtransactions are awesome, pay this to get a better territory, that sort of solves its own problems relating to difficulty. So closes this edition of the Gaming Codex. Come back next time when we will discuss a different term. Goodbye.